AP Bio students, this is Mr. Laudermouth. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you, as the case may be. Today we're going to look at some notes from Chapter 44 dealing with ecosystems, energy, nutrients, and the whole idea of cycles in the ecosystem. Cycles of nutrients, but also looking at, in general, cycles connecting consumers, producers, all the parts, abiotic and biotic, that go into making a dynamic ecosystem. So we ought to take a minute and just talk about the levels we're going to be looking at in our study of ecology. We can look at the individual organism. We can look at an entire population of the same species. We can look at a community and see how different populations, these could be animals, plants, decomposers, interact together. But our main focus for today is going to be at the largest level. Well, I guess you could say you could go up even larger and look at the biome or the entire biosphere, but kind of the largest level we'll be concerned with in this unit is the ecosystem, which is the community, all of the living, the biotic factors, plus energy, plus the abiotic factors. So, what are the essential questions we're going to try to answer today with this lecture? Well, what limits productivity in ecosystems? How do nutrients move in the ecosystem? And this will actually get to in part 2 of the lecture, how does energy move through the ecosystem? A little bit of a spoiler here, you should hopefully be aware already, having studied chemistry, possibly physics, of the law of conservation of mass. So we know that, for instance, nutrients, being made of atoms and molecules, cannot be created out of nothing, nor can they be entirely lost to the ecosystem. Energy, however, is subject to the second law of thermodynamics, which you might remember from chemistry or physics, which says that in any transfer of energy, some of it is lost as heat, some of it is turned into an unusable form. So because of that loss to entropy, it's also known as the law of entropy, energy has to constantly be fed into an ecosystem in order to sustain it. So we often say that energy flows through an ecosystem while matter, nutrients, cycle within it. Okay, so as I mentioned, the ecosystem is your community of biotic factors plus all the abiotic factors. That would, of course, include things like water, components of the soil, gases in the air. During these transfers of nutrients in the ecosystem, we also have transformations of energy and processes that change matter from one form to another. Ecosystems, in order to be self-sustaining, have to be able to capture energy from somewhere. For 99.9% of the ecosystems on Earth, that's of course going to be the sun. These ecosystems must transfer energy into a form that living things can use, and they have to move nutrients around. We have to cycle things like carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, those elements that we discussed back in biochemistry that make up most of the body of individual organisms. So we got to focus for a moment on two big inputs, energy and nutrients. We get this constant energy input from the sun, and it's flowing through the ecosystem. It can be captured into different forms of energy, at least temporarily, but eventually all the energy that got captured from the sun is going to be lost as heat. It's going to be turned into a form of energy living things cannot use to do work. That energy is going to have to be replaced by a new flow of sunlight energy. Nutrients, however, stay within the ecosystem. Now they can be rearranged, they can be used to make different molecules, they can be stored for a while in one form or another, they can be kept in the water, they can be stored in the air. These are what we call the different reservoirs for nutrients, but they don't ever leave or get destroyed, disintegrate into nothing. So these nutrients are constantly being recycled. So as I mentioned, we got to deal with conservation of mass here, as well as the second law of thermodynamics. There's no escaping those, and they're the main reasons why nutrients cycle, but energy flows. Nutrients can only cycle because matter cannot be created or destroyed. So let's take a minute and look at a generalized nutrient cycling diagram. We always have some kind of abiotic reservoir, a place where the majority of this particular nutrient or element is being stored when it's not within the body of a living organism. Now, that abiotic reservoir can get replenished usually through geologic processes. If we're talking about elements that are, say, trapped below the Earth's surface in rocks, it's not really fair to say that those are part of the ecosystem, since there's no way those are getting directly into the bodies of living organisms. But through geologic processes, they can become part of the soil and then get taken in by producers and enter the food chain. Once we've entered the food chain and those nutrients are part of producers' bodies, they can pass to consumers if consumers eat producers. And eventually, all of those nutrients, be they in producer or consumer bodies, can get returned to the reservoir or back into the food chain through the action of decomposers. Those decomposers, mainly bacteria and fungi, are what connect all the different trophic levels of your food web. Because those nutrients, in order to be recycled, have to get back to their starting point, and it's the decomposers that allow that to happen. So we can return to the abiotic reservoir through the aid of decomposers. Let's look at a couple specific examples of nutrient cycles in the ecosystem, starting with the carbon cycle. We know that carbon is very important. Life is based on organic chemistry, the chemistry of carbon. Most of the carbon on Earth is in a reservoir in the atmosphere. So we have CO2 up in the air. Now that carbon dioxide can be incorporated into the bodies of producers, into plants via photosynthesis. We've talked about the Calvin cycle and how CO2s can be used to build sugars. Plants can use those sugars to build their own bodies, but if they get consumed by animals, the carbon that was trapped by the plants now is incorporated into animal bodies, into consumers. When those plants and animals die, the decomposers can return that carbon into the soil to be reused by plants again, or they can turn it directly back into carbon dioxide and send it back into the reservoir in the atmosphere. Occasionally, there are sort of side paths this cycle takes. If the dead material gets trapped underground long enough, it can become fossil fuels, oil, gas, coal. It can dissolve into water and be part of aquatic food chains. Those also undergo photosynthesis. They have decomposers of their own. And of course, we can't ignore the fact that humans do have an impact on this cycle. When we burn fossil fuels, we're releasing stored carbon that had been stored in some cases for many millions of years back into the reservoir. That's going to increase the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere above what it normally would have been. The impact of this, of course, carbon dioxide does contribute to global warming. It can contribute to pollution. And if humans remove the producers from an ecosystem, the plants that can take the CO2 out of the atmosphere, now you're removing any mechanism for lowering the concentration of CO2 in the air. So a couple important things to note again. The CO2 reservoir is in the air. It passes into the food chain via photosynthesis. It returns to the atmosphere via respiration. So we've got reservoir, photosynthesis, the Calvin cycle, fixing carbon so it becomes part of living organisms. Recycling requires respiration to turn stored carbon back into CO2, or combustion if we're burning fossil fuels that will recreate carbon dioxide and send it back into the atmosphere. Let's look at the nitrogen cycle. Here again we have most of the nitrogen available in gaseous form. It's in the air as N2 gas. Now N2 is not particularly useful to any living organism. It has to be turned into an oxidized form of nitrogen, like nitrite or nitrate. Once that happens, then it can be taken up by plants, and then the nitrogen stored in the plants can be used by animals. Now, the organisms that are taking this atmospheric nitrogen and turning it into a form useful to plants, we call those nitrogen-fixing bacteria. You'll find them in the soil, but some of them actually have a symbiotic relationship with plants directly. They live in the roots of plants. They provide nitrate molecules for the plants to use. The plants in turn share some of the sugars they make with the nitrogen-fixing bacteria so that they get a food source. It's a good mutual relationship. So here we get a close-up of some of these nitrogen-fixing bacteria nodules growing on the roots of plants. They're in aquatic ecosystems. You also have microscopic organisms, plankton, that can accomplish nitrogen-fixing tasks with the aid of bacteria. When these plants and animals die, again, this is where decomposers come into the picture. They break down the bodies of these plants and animals. They can return nitrogen in the form of, say, amino acids to the soil, where other bacteria can actually denitrify it. There are bacteria that will take the nitrate that the nitrogen-fixing bacteria made and turn it back into N2 gas, sending it back into the atmospheric reservoir. So again, if this is going to be a cycle, there has to be a way of getting back to the beginning, and these denitrifying bacteria allow us to do that. So reservoir in the atmosphere, enters the food chain via nitrogen fixation by bacteria. Recycling requires decomposition and the aid of denitrifying bacteria in order to get back into the abiotic reservoir. Let's take a minute and look at the phosphorus cycle. Compared to carbon and nitrogen, the phosphorus cycle actually takes a lot longer to complete. That's because the main reservoir for phosphorus is not in the atmosphere. It's actually rocks and minerals trapped below the surface of the Earth. As I mentioned before, if you're trapped below the surface of the Earth, it's not like you can be directly used by plants and animals. Instead, you got to wait for geology to push those rocks and minerals closer to the surface, where erosive forces like wind and water can break down the rocks into smaller and smaller pieces. Those can then be incorporated into the soil and finally taken up by the roots of plants to enter the food chain. So while it's still in the form of rock and mineral, phosphorus is not particularly useful. Only when it's broken down, oxidized, and dissolved into the soil or into water for aquatic ecosystems can it then be used by living plants, by producers. When those producers die, again, decomposers like bacteria and fungi can return the phosphate back into the soil or back into the water for use again by other plants. When those plants get eaten by consumers, they take in the phosphorus. When they die, of course, decomposers break them down and send their phosphorus nutrients back into the soil or back into the water. So our main abiotic reservoir, rocks and minerals. Only through a slow process of erosion can we create soluble phosphate capable of being taken in by producers. In order to recycle it back for producers to use, we need decomposing bacteria and fungi. I haven't yet mentioned how you get back to the abiotic reservoir. Again, cycles have to get back to the beginning. So how can we take all this phosphorus that was now dissolved in water or dissolved in the soil and turn it back into rocks? Because that's what we'd have to do. Well, the answer is in the oceans mainly, because again, most bodies of water drain eventually into the oceans. Some of that dissolved phosphorus settles to the bottom of the ocean, forming sediment at the bottom. As layer after layer of sediment is deposited, the weight above gets higher and higher, crushing some of that phosphate mineral back into phosphate rock. So again, long, slow process. It took a long time to dissolve and break down the rocks to release the phosphorus. It takes a long time to turn dissolved phosphorus back into solid rock. Once it is solid rock, again, it's trapped at the bottom of the ocean. It may take millions of years and lots of geologic upheaval for those rocks to eventually come back to the surface to be eroded again to release that phosphorus back into the food chain, back into the ecosystem. Then we have the water cycle. It's weird to think of water being a nutrient, but of course it is. We know as part of photosynthesis, there's photolysis. Plants have to take in water and at the chloroplast split the water, releasing oxygen gas as a waste product, in order to generate the hydrogen ions and the electrons needed to run the light-dependent reactions, in order to make the ATP and NADPH needed to make sugars in the Calvin cycle. So we can treat water like any other nutrient, and it does follow a cycle. We can start with the main reservoir, which is, of course, the oceans. We can also throw in freshwater sources like lakes, rivers. Of course, there is some water trapped in the ice caps and in glaciers in mountainous regions. When the liquid water evaporates, travels up into the atmosphere. With changes in pressure and temperature, it can condense into clouds. The clouds release the water as precipitation, as rain, snow, sleet, etc. It falls back to the earth. Some of it falls directly back into the ocean. Some of it falls into lakes and rivers, replenishing the freshwater sources. That water then can travel around. It can enter the groundwater through percolation. It can be stored underground for some time in aquifers, but eventually it makes its way back into the oceans where it can evaporate again, completing the cycle. So we have precipitation sending the water as a liquid back to the earth. We have transpiration along with evaporation taking liquid water and sending it back up into the atmosphere as water vapor. And connecting terrestrial water sources to the ocean, we have a runoff process where lakes feed into rivers and rivers run to the oceans. So our main reservoir in this case is surface water, but also atmospheric water. There's a good deal of water vapor in the atmosphere. It enters the food chain via precipitation. Plants can then absorb water through their roots in the soil. The process of transpiration and evaporation sends the liquid water back into the atmosphere, and eventually, as runoff, it can return to the oceans, completing the cycle. We should take a minute and remind ourselves just what transpiration is. We've talked about this before. Liquid water enters the roots of plants because that's going from high water potential to low. The water, once it's in the plant roots, once it's in the xylem vessels, will form nice chains of water molecules held together by hydrogen bonding. The water is, if you remember, cohesive. It likes to stick to other water molecules. It's also adhesive. It likes to stick to the walls of the xylem. This allows for the creation of a long, thin chain, essentially, of water molecules. If you pull it from the top of the plant, you can pull a continuous chain of water molecules up from the roots at the bottom. What's doing the pulling? Well, it's not an active transport process. It's just the result of evaporation through the stomata of the leaves caused by temperature, often by sunlight. Increasing the temperature within the leaves, causing evaporation. As each water molecule becomes a gas and leaves, it pulls the next one behind it up into the leaf. So we have this continuous movement of water molecules from the roots up into the leaves and eventually then out into the atmosphere as water vapor. Now, I mentioned that humans can disrupt the carbon cycle by adding more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere by burning fossil fuels. We can also disrupt the water cycle through the process of deforestation. If you remove the plants that are on the surface of the earth, transpiration is not going to happen. Transpiration is a plant-based way of taking liquid water and evaporating it into water vapor, sending it into the atmosphere. If you're not sending any water up into the atmosphere, there's no water to come back down, so there's no precipitation. So if you cut down a forest, very often what you get is not then a grassland or a scrubland. You'll actually produce a desert because now there's no way of getting water up into the atmosphere. There's no way for precipitation then to spread water over this area, so it becomes a desert. It becomes very dry. We call this process desertification. Now, if deforestation is causing the problem, reforestation can help repair the damage. Around the world, there's a movement called the Green Belt. In East Africa, people are planting lots and lots of trees to create a sustainable ecosystem, because not only can the people then use the products of the forest to improve their own lives, they can actually then harvest some of those products and sell them and build capital that way. So because this requires people working together, it actually helps promote democracy. And much of the work in East Africa is actually being done by women. So it's actually empowering women, giving them more voice in their communities and in their government. And that has actually led to a Nobel Peace Prize being bestowed in 2004. The effects of deforestation have been studied extensively. One of the most famous experiments happened in New Hampshire. It's called the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest. They took 38 acres of this forest and they completely stripped it of all plant cover. They complete deforestation of this area. They then used precipitation collectors to measure how much rainfall there was, and because this area sloped downhill, they were able to collect runoff water and measure how much nutrients were being carried away by the water. What they found was very, very shocking. In the deforested part of the forest, there was a 40% increase in runoff. So 40% increase in the amount of water that was not being trapped in the soil, that was simply flowing along the surface and leaving the area. That increase in runoff also meant an increase in nutrient loss. In the deforested area, which is the red line on this graph here, there's a 60 times increase in the amount of nitrogen being lost, and 10 times the amount of calcium is being lost. Because you remove the trees, there's no plants there taking in these nutrients through their roots and holding on to it in their bodies. So there's nothing then for decomposers to recycle back into the soil, because there's nothing for the decomposers to eat. All of these nutrients that were in the soil then just get swept away by all this runoff. And while in the greater sense it's being recycled because it's not disappearing, it is leaving these particular 38 acres of forest not to return. So that's going to greatly slow natural regrowth of the forest in that area. So why is nitrogen so important? Well, we know plants use the nitrogen to make amino acids, to build proteins. Animals then consume it as part of the food chain. All right, I think that's a good place to stop with this lecture. We'll pick it up at lecture number 2. I'll see you then.